I'll try not to break into song whilst holding this. So welcome, thank you for coming along. I realise I've got quite a lot of slides, so I'm going to be moving fairly quickly. But hopefully some of the sort of basic stuff, because it's about time banking, is stuff you're already familiar with. And if you're thinking about social and complementary currencies, then there's been decades, if not longer, of experimentation, depending on when you think the start point essentially is. Some of the ideas underpinning these, promotions, these developments, these ideas around different economies, looking at issues around production, consumption, production, sustainability as the main sort of ways of thinking through how the economy can be different, and in some extent, for some, particularly time banking, how social life can be different as well. But there seems to be some barriers to success. There's lots of innovation, lots of development, lots of failure, lots of turnover of different currencies, different systems. And it's great as always to come to this sort of conference and see so many systems in place and the shared learning that happens. But what I'm trying to do in this presentation essentially is take a bit of a step back and not look so much at a currency system in particular, but some of the broader context in which those systems operate. And to a certain extent, more so in my own field of social policy or social welfare than maybe in some of the community currency debates, there's a missing part to the story. And I think actually in this conference, we've heard it quite a few times that the economic crisis has been a trigger for lots of innovation, lots of development in alternative currencies. I know in Birmingham, where I'm based, we're working on developing a Birmingham pound, but we can't quite find the model that works. And so there's a focus on economic regeneration. I've heard it mentioned in a few presentations at this conference as well, that the need to prepare for the next crisis is a key driver. And that's an important thing to consider. But at the same time, there's this missing part of the story, which is the social dimension as well. And time banking, I think, more so than some other community currencies, highlights this quite well. But what you get is a discussion that what's happened since 2008, 2007 is a switch from a financial crisis to a fiscal crisis. That the actual problem is no longer the economy, it's social spending, it's welfare provision, it's the constant needs and demands of the public. How dare they have these needs and demands? And so you get these sort of headlines from the Telegraph in the UK, and you'll see them represented. I think the bottom picture was when I was looking for images around Greece and austerity, the European austerity debate. There's these images that it's no longer necessarily the financial system that's the problem, it's the social spending. So there's this idea that needs to be fixed and not the economic system, and we know that's not necessarily the case or true. So what I'm doing in this presentation, hopefully, is starting it. So this is a bit of introductory social policy for you all now. So this is on the far left-hand column. It's a bad scan, I'm afraid. You've got Maslow's hierarchy of need. And across the top, you have the three different ways in which welfare provision can be met. You've got the market, you've got public finance and the provision, and you've got the informal sector, which is usually the family or community. And as you can see, sort of mapped against here, the market is, quite good at doing some things, but other things in terms of meeting those that hierarchy of need, it's not so good. The state is better, or even the informal sector is better. And this is one of the things I'm trying to draw attention to, is that when we're discussing community currencies, we need to also fit them into this wider debate around the sort of social welfare domain and how they fit. Because, predominantly they're going to be in this informal sector of community, potentially family as well. Some of the time banking presentations, particularly, again, the UK context of time banking, they're starting to overlap a bit with that public sector and public finance and provision as well. So what I'm trying to do then is just quickly draw out some of the key lessons from this community for my subject, social policy, but for this particular presentation, draw out some of the sort of shared languages and challenges, which is kind of feeding into the next research project I'm in the process of developing. So the ending is kind of thrown out there for comments, critique, questions, and what have you. I'm interested in finding completely different ways of developing welfare systems and economies. So it's not just one economic aspect, it's the welfare as well. They're the same sides of the one coin, essentially. welfare provision depends on the economy, depends on economic growth. So when you start introducing new community currencies, new forms of money, whichever language we want to use, what does that mean for welfare? We need to keep that in mind. And again, drawing predominantly on the UK, we can see a range of different historical experimentations with alternative forms of production and consumption. So Robert Owen in the labour exchanges is something we've heard mentioned a few times. Major Douglas after the Second World War and the Green Shirt movement, perhaps something most of you won't be familiar with, but the idea of social credit, this recognition that wages are insufficient to consume and that you need to provide some form of social credit, some addition to wages so that people can consume, people can actually, get what they need to survive. And then towards the end, then we've got the stuff we're more familiar with, so community currencies, the transitions towns movement or transition networks, and issues around informal work as well. So drawing on sort of human geography, sort of theory and practice, there's this idea of alterity. I don't like alternatives so much because you need to have something to be an alternative to. And alterity is this idea that it's a bit more diverse, it's a bit more flexible. You don't necessarily need to confirm or what it is you're in opposition to, although generally it's neoliberalism. Let's just be honest about that. But then you got into questions about what is neoliberalism, and academics debates this and produce whole books on it. But I quite like this Jonas quote here, that alterity is being alternative by believing in the possibility of an economic and political other. And I think, again, sometimes the political dimension is lost. It was really interesting in the session I was just at before this one, that the political aspect and political decision making which underpins time banking was kind of under the spotlight a bit. So recognizing that economic, political, economic, social, they're all interlinked with each other. And Jones and Fuller, they break that down again into lots of different distinctions. So when we're talking about alterity, when we're talking about alternatives, there's an additional, so it's an additional choice alongside capitalism. Alternative oppositional, so coping mechanisms where existing provision fails. I think UK time banking probably fits in there at the moment. And alternative substitutes, which is establishing an activity to challenge mainstream institutions. I think that's quite often where lots of currency is, although if you think about the name change in terms of complementary currencies, community currencies, alternative currencies, is it still that radical? Is it actually about fitting in or supporting or maintaining the existing system? There's lots of shades of grey here, which I think academically as well as in terms of practitioners, we need to maybe focus on and explore a bit more. Some of the other things which underpin some of the sort of debates and issues we think about are the ideas of circuits of value, so that material and economic life are performed and reproduced, that there's lots of different circuits of value that exist within the community. It's not just one. Again, just highlighting the sort of things we're already aware of. But I like this last bit more probably about a wider questioning of how things gain value. So how certain things gained the value that they have. Why are they worth X amounts? Why aren't they worth something different? Again, in the session we just had on time banking, there's this significant debate around, well, what if it's more labor intensive in 1 hour in one activity compared to another? How do you differentiate? I don't think you should. But, there's lots of debate to have there. And then more recently, Castells and colleagues have just published this book, Another Economy is Possible. It's interesting because it highlights the cultural nature of the economy, and that it's actually fundamentally built on different aspects of human culture. They highlight things like patriarchy, for example, as well as some of the sort of things we'd already associate with it. But I kind of felt it said like the stuff we've been saying for quite a few years. So it's interesting, but I don't think it's necessarily anything entirely new. So the economy is shaped by culture. I think the key message which comes out of it is the need to reimagine and rethink. And again, that's kind of what we've been doing. But from a few years now of researching time banking, I'm starting to think, well, why is it not these ideas moving into other areas, into sort of social policy? And here's where we start moving into language, I guess, because essentially lots of the things are already there. So if I just skip back a couple of slides, you've got alternative, additional, oppositional, and substitute. But if we look into sort of social policy narratives around self-help, key roles essentially map the same as those three terms there. So self-help organizations as a solution to particular social problems that the state wants solved but doesn't necessarily want to directly get involved with or might provide some funding for. Self-help as a springboard into new activities, new forms of social welfare provision, both of those kind of existing within or alongside the state provision, or as an alternative, so something which is, again, questioning some of the values which underpin welfare provision more broadly. And that's where the next sort of state responses come into. Well, it's actually compatible. So the big society in the UK was a brief flash in the pan idea from about 2010 to about 2013-14. Supported lots of huge development in time banking, actually, got lots of government attention to it, but saw it as a form of new mutualism which fitted into the wider neoliberal sort of ideas of that government. The idea that it's a continuum, that's just one part of a bigger spectrum of activity, or conflictual, that's something which is, seeking change, seeking challenge. So for me, and this is what I've written a bit about in terms of time banking, is that the key difference isn't exactly that measure of value. And here it's about use value. So not exchange value, as quite often is the case with currencies or money, but it's about what that time is being valued for. And in my PhD research was a few years old now, so obviously means I'm getting old, sadly. But the PhD research highlighted that through the interviews with participants, that the credit itself, the actual voucher, was meaningless to them. It was the activity they were engaged with and what it actually meant to them. So it starts this idea of thinking about how we can actually value things differently. And again, this isn't any new debate. So one of the sort of leading socialist thinkers in the UK back in the early 1900s, Richard Tawney, argued around this idea of function. And the quote is, sort of definition is up on the slide there, an activity which embodies and expresses the idea of social purpose. The essence of it is that the agent does not perform it merely for personal gain or to gratify himself, but recognizes that he is responsible for discharge to some higher authority. And that higher authority was society, so not the state. And I feel like this is incredibly important because what Tawney's essentially arguing is that there's certain activities which are functionless, that they don't produce any sort of wider benefit to society, only that sort of profit-making, accumulation, wealth accumulation in particular, which is beneficial to the individual and not necessarily to the whole wider social body. So what we start to see then, and the New Economics Foundation have been sort of key in the UK for developing this, is this idea of developing alternative economics, sometimes linked with new forms of social welfare, bringing in sort of anti-productivist economics, so ideas which isn't about constant production, constant growth, the idea of zero growth economics, and sort of planning. They've suggested planning public services along this zero growth idea, generally drawing in co-production, therefore generally drawing in time banking, but again, not necessarily making it explicit as to how that looks in practice. And then some discussion that I've added to just here around use value rather than exchange value in time. So those are the sort of key lessons you can draw out from community currencies, but when you start taking that into the wider sort of social policy, social welfare context, it gets a bit more tricky because welfare provision has always historically been linked to economic growth. The rise of industrialization creates lots of social problems, creates the welfare state which responds to those social problems. So the money to actually fund that welfare state has come out of that economic activity. So if we're looking at anti-productivist approaches, then you start reducing the amount of production, reducing the amount of growth. That's going to have an impact on welfare provision. So you need to then rethink, well, what does anti-productivist welfare provision look like? Similar sort of argument along the lines of zero growth. What does a zero growth public service look like? And so part of my PhD was trying to draw out some of the practice of time banking around that sort of idea of use value and embed that into a community project run by a local health service in one of the strange sort of health authority setups we had in parts of the UK. And it completely failed, partly because of a practice issue, partly because not all the people involved in the sort of planning of the service could quite get their heads around co-production, use value, that different way of interacting with service providers. So in the book, based on the PhD, there's kind of three things. The bottom two I draw out more than the first, which is trying to argue that actually time banking can generate something different, can generate something new. Again, it's been mentioned a few times sort of over the last couple of days, but the solidarity economy, or what we might call collectivism, if we were to be, social democratic about it, is there. But it's the idea of care in time. And I was quite interested in the plenary speaker when he was highlighting this need to focus about care in time. I was sat there thinking, well, we've heard that argument for quite a few years now. The politics of care, the care time, these are all things which have underpinned time banking development and lots of community currency developments more broadly. And yet that language isn't transferring easily into that wider economic debate or that wider sort of welfare debate. And the same with time. And again, we picked up on that in quite a few of the time bank focus sessions at this conference. But in particular here, like I sort of alluded to, that idea of use value and that use of time being slightly more important than what you can exchange it for. And sometimes I relate that to this idea of the task, that actually the task itself is what's important, is what matters, and actually giving time to the task to do it well is what you need. And Thompson about finding new ways of thinking about production, moving away from how much time we need to produce in an hour to make so much profit. Actually, it's about going back before capitalism, seeing what ideas were around, so there's some old ideas we can revitalize into the sort of current context. And then we get to some of the more challenging language. So these are the 4 terms which almost every political party will be using in the UK over the next couple of weeks as they battle out for the general election. But again, they're languages, they're words which have significant meaning in the community currency system, just as they do in social policy. And yet what I highlight, and again, I draw on some of the Gibson-Graham work here around how neoliberalism, capitalism presents itself, to illustrate that lots of this language is rightly or wrongly been appropriated by political advocates of variations of neoliberalism. New Labour in the UK had a sort of social justice, neoliberal hybrid. For David Cameron and his government, it was around the big society. I'm not quite sure what Theresa May stands for, but I'm sure she has some idea, which might become apparent in the next couple of days. We don't know. But essentially, all of these terms are ones which, we will stand up as advocates and practitioners and academics around community currencies and talk about the importance of these values, just as much as the people who we're not campaigning against, but arguing against, will also use that same language. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, to promoting this alterity, which is embedded in the community currency movement, is around language and how we find the right language or how we reappropriate some of these terms, some of these ideas. And this is one of my favorite little pamphlets, which I always try and get my students to read. A guy called Colin Ward writing about anarchy in social policy. So there's not many people who talk about this. And this is the sort of current thinking. And actually, this is what I was going to say in relation to this has changed since coming to the conference slightly. So listening to some of the conference discussions around how community currencies, time banks have helped particular groups, migrants, deprived groups, impoverished groups, I'm starting to wonder if there's a group of people who are too poor for money and whether that's going to start creating a particular image around some of these community currencies. And actually, this is why I've edited the slides to put that middle section in bold. So the likely a slow renewal of self-help and mutual aid principle seems to me to emerge from the new so-called underclass of those people rejected by the economy in alliance with the déclassé people who just can't stomach the current economic and social values. And actually, I've read this quote out many, many times in many presentations and lectures, and actually that middle bit has taken on a completely new meaning for me at this conference, in that there is this potential coalition, if you like, between ourselves and the communities we help. But the problem we have still is one of language, in that it talks about the underclass and people rejected from the economy. 1996, so it's quite old now, but I'm sure you've heard about gig economy, 0 hours contracts. So the way in which people are employed is fundamentally changing. So what we actually have, so in my previous work, my presentation at the second version of this conference back in The Hague, I talked about co-option, about how time banking in particular has been co-opted in the UK context into this sort of welfare, big society agenda. It's about promoting the government's aims, essentially. And some of the time banking UK stuff I've heard at this conference has made me think that's moved further along in that direction more recently. But what we also have now is Co-option Plus, because I couldn't come up with a better name, is that with 0 hours contracts, with underemployment in particular, highest levels of poverty in the UK are attached to the underemployed. Around half of people who are in poverty, in work poverty, are underemployed. They just don't have enough work hours. So this production consumption thing, which go back to Robert Owen, go back to social credit, back into the early 1900s, is still an issue over 100 years later. And yet my concern now is actually the currencies we're potentially coming up with, which might help address this, are going to be marginalized as, to a large extent, how the credit union movement in the UK has been, is poor people's banks. This becomes poor people's money. This becomes money which, you know, respectable people, respectable elements of society don't have. So my interest then is, you know, how do we protect the sources of innovation in that sort of potential context of marginalization in which community currencies are potentially moving into? And this was just to highlight that there's two different campaigns going on at the moment, post sort of 2008. You've got the large scale, we don't like the economic system, which is, you know, global movements like Occupy, and then you've got the local initiatives that, you know, we've been talking about at this conference. How do we make them speak to each other? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's time for questions. Do you prefer I will collect two as you want? Yeah, yeah. One by one? Yeah. Okay. Questions? Okay, no question. It seems no questions. Okay, one question.
Because yesterday we were in another session talking about Toreke's case in Belgium. I don't know if that rings a bell. The person who presented also said that this currency could be or was perceived as the money of the poor, see, like something for the underclass. Mm-hmm. And a discussion arose around what is the ideology behind what we're promoting here. I don't know if co-production of services or this, you know, time banking used for social policy, which I promote a lot. I think time banks are a great tool for social policy. But what is the ideology behind this? Because someone from Scandinavia said that this was against the social democratic way, you know, universal welfare state, and that this wasn't, you know, it's not really a question, or yes, or the question is, what is the ideology behind this? And what is the role, its role in the context of cutting down the welfare state or expanding it?
Yeah, I was in that session, so that's some of the things that have then changed the end of the presentation.
Okay.
And I was thinking this last night in terms. So one of the first year modules I teach is around key concepts in social policy. So it talks about how do we define citizenship, need, equality, social justice, and you know, in that example, I think it worked out as like €250 an hour equivalency.
Yes.
You address that, and I think I think you hit on the head the key point, which is what's the underpinning ideology. And I think looking at the UK sort of experimentation with time banking, at the moment it's very much in that sort of neoliberal self-help idea. Yeah. And it's doing some great things in terms of local communities, but it's not doing the sort of more radical, revolutionary, dare I say that word, stuff, which might then go on to challenge some of the actual context in which those people are having to live and why they need to rely on those currencies. So that's how do we articulate that ideology is what I'm trying to think through at the moment.
Okay, me too. So let's talk about it later, okay?
Other questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.